Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, window into India's international relations, India's foreign policy, India's major strategic partnerships, and also global and regional developments that have an impact on India's rise in the world. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up an interesting trend of rising military expenditure by major countries around the world. Growing military spending and what that does to India's options and choices. This is the topic for this episode, and to discuss this I have a very distinguished expert joining me in the studio. Let me introduce you to him, Air Marshal Anil Chopra. Air Marshal Chopra is a distinguished retired officer of the Indian Air Force. He is currently Director General of the Center for Air Power Studies and a very prominent thinker and writer on strategic affairs. Air Marshal, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you so much, Sreeram. Always a pleasure. I've been watching your show for many months now, and I must say that you're doing a great job, not only putting the things in correct perspective, but also educating the masses in the country. Yes.
Thank you so much. Air Marshal, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, has come up with the latest data about global military expenditure. And there is a consistent secular increase in global military spending since 2015. And there's, if you see a decade-wise, there's almost a 19% increase in global military expenditure. All the trends are looking upwards. Defense manufacturers are having a great time because their products are in high demand. But the first and foremost question is, why are so many countries feeling so insecure, and why are they stockpiling weapons and acquiring more and more advanced weapons? Why are they spending so much on military? And what happened to that, the halcyon days of the post-Cold War period when almost all the major powers were reducing defense budgets, but now the defense budgets are just rising and zooming up. So we're in a much more insecure and dangerous world. Your thoughts on why this is happening?
Yeah, Sreeram, $2.2 trillion is the global spend, which has come out with SIPRI report. And we know that that's 3.7% increase from last year. Yes, where has the increase been? And the Americans, of course, the largest defense spenders, they have increased by 4%, China by 7%, India by 13%, Russia by 40% because of the war, and Ukraine by 640%. That's the kind of increase. There has been a war in the last few years, whether it was in Afghanistan, whether it was in Iraq before that. So a fresh Cold War is developing, in Europe. Now, I'll give you some more figures. America spends more than the next 14 countries put together.
Yeah.
China spends 8 times the remaining, double the amount that's spent by the next 8 countries. So there is a large amount of defense expenditure. There's war in Europe. There's Indo-Pacific competition building up. So these increases are taking place. But if you see that inflation and other reasons, 3.7 is not too large, increase. Yes.
And you mentioned the theaters. If you look at the data, the bulk of the defense spending is coming obviously from Europe because of the ongoing war, Russia-Ukraine, but also from Oceania and Asia and the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia is a big, for example, spender. After India, Saudi Arabia is next in terms of the overall spending. So it's quite clear that conflict theaters and preparation for conflict or even active combat, these seem to be driving up these trends. And in that sense, it's looking more dangerous, right? The long peace has ended, so to say, after 1991. And now more and more theaters are, sucking up the oxygen in terms of resources of governments and countries. So either you're already in a war or you're preparing for war. That seems to be the logic behind this. So it looks like a very gloomy scenario in terms of global security.
See, first 15 countries in the world are spending 82% of the defense expenditure in the world. And first 5 are spending 63%. So first, Europe. Europe has had the largest increase in defense budget since last year, 13%. Relatively, the West Asia, Asia, Oceania, these are relatively less. Of course, Africa, the total defense budget is on the decline, minus 5%. So Now, there's a saying, one American president had said long time back that the American democracy is run by the military-industrial complex of America.
Yeah, Eisenhower, yeah.
Eisenhower in 61. We all remember this famous, and of course, by the gun lobby. So America is all the time, their defense military complex is all the time looking for some war somewhere. Now, because of what has happened in Ukraine last year, Europe, NATO has given instructions that each country in NATO must go up to 2% of the defense budget by 2030 or 2033, what is the figure. There are countries like Poland which said that they will go up 4% of GDP next year. So that is the kind of increases that are taking place. The number of NATO countries have increased now by another 3 new entrants, and there is going to be increased defense budgets in Europe and also in Indo-Pacific, because they are the two theaters of future action. Yes.
And Air Marshal, the contingency planning, I mean, one is that these are responses to immediate exigencies of an ongoing conflict, right? But if you look at the longer term, over the decade or something, then it looks like nobody is really assured that it's going to be a peaceful environment. I mean, there seems to be definitely the return of great power politics and contention, and we are in a different era, right? And that you know, the quieter phase is over, and in that sense, the militaries are, you know, playing a bigger role. The defense industrial complexes, as you're saying, are playing a bigger role, and perhaps the diplomacy and the, you know, civilian side of international relations is taking a back seat, because it looks like the men in boots are needed and are back in demand.
You know, when Americans moved out of Afghanistan, we were hoping that they will continue to concentrate only in the competition in Indo-Pacific. Nobody thought that they will drive Russia to a position that a conflict will begin in Ukraine. Of course, the West feels differently. They feel that the Russians have invaded. But we all know that the situation has been created where NATO has physically moved on the borders of Russia. And since there is no buffer, Russia had no choice, because Ukraine had said that they will also want to join NATO, and this was unacceptable to Russia. And this war could have been highly avoided if this not. Let us look at the areas of conflict now. Europe, which had had a peaceful time since the end of Cold War, is now becoming an area of action. The Russians are spending more. They have spent $87 billion last year.
More than India.
That's more than India. Nearly 40% increase, and they're going to spend much more. The action in Indo-Pacific, there is something called the Pacific Defense Initiative. This is a huge chunk of money which America gives to this, to build up and support the countries around that. US Pacific Command is the largest command. So these are the two. Earlier, we have had West Asia. Of course, there are dynamics happening here. Israel is, stabilizing its defense expenditures. Saudis, Iranians have started talking. There is some churn taking place. Central Asia, also the influence of China, Russia, there is action here. And of course, for India, our two borders remain live. China border has become, very active in the last 3 years. And with Pakistan, things are not improving. So there are specific pockets where there is action, and therefore there will be greater military spending. Yes,
absolutely. Zones of action are in a way growing in number and in geographical spread, says Air Marshal Anil Chopra. And viewers, talking of India and our security imperatives, our military spending, obviously China is the #1 adversary that India is facing, and we have had a very difficult last few years of relationship with them, including active fighting on the borders, which has led to loss of lives on both sides. And in that context, I'd like you to hear India's Chief of Army Staff, General Manoj Pandey, talking about China, its intentions and its capabilities, and how we need to respond to that. Let's hear General Pandey and resume the discussion.
China's economic transition and technological progression has given it the capability to emerge as a major military power. Concurrent to its military rise, its strategic doctrines too have seen various shades, from a war zone concept of fighting a limited war under high-tech conditions to the three warfares approach entailing public opinion, psychological warfare, and legal warfare, and of late to that of an unrestricted warfare with conventional capacities being available to effect massive destruction of an adversary. It is increasingly displaying a willingness to project its military power as seen from its aggressive attempts to establish military bases in the Indo-Pacific, Africa, and more importantly, in our immediate neighborhood as well. The rapid expansion of PLA Navy is reflective of its extra-regional power projection intentions. The proliferation of its military weapons, equipment, and technology is enhancing military capabilities of a number of states, some in South Asia too, which is of concern. Its forays in the South China Sea, rejection of international tribunal awards on maritime claims, activities in the Taiwan Straits, and actions along the LAC bordering on bellicosity make it increasingly apparent that China's interpretation of an international rules-based order rests on might is right.
So viewers, you just heard snippets of important speech given by India's Chief of Army Staff. Air Marshal Chopra, COA is talking about the Chinese intent and also the military doctrines and the amount of resources they are pouring into their long-term objective of achieving hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. And it's in that context really that we need to put this SIPRI data and the military spending in context, because we already spoke about what is happening in Europe, and which is less of a direct strategic concern for us. But here you have next door a bellicose neighbor, as Chief of Army Staff is saying, and which is officially spending $291 million or $292 billion. But then many dispute the official data and say that probably the Chinese are spending double or more than double of what is officially stated. So we are talking about a country that's bulking up very fast, and it has the fastest growing navy, and the kind of investments they are making. It shows that they are aiming to dominate our entire maritime and even land borders. So it's in that kind of context there where we need to talk about military spending, what the Chinese are doing, and in response we are seeing not only India, which is rising, increasing its outlays, but also Japan, Australia, all of them have announced large-scale build-ups to try and counterbalance, because there is an imbalance that's developing, isn't it? And that's the fundamental problem that we in Asia are staring at when we look at the massive Chinese defense budgets.
Sreeram, I must tell you that nearly for 20 years, Chinese have had yearly defense budget increase of 10% or more. Only in the last 3-4 years, the figure has come below 10%. Significant. Because the economy is large, the 10% is a huge physical sum. So that is what China has been. China is very clear. The Communist Party has given clear direction. They want to be a superpower. They will be a technology power by 2025, by 2049, with 100 years of Communist Party's
centenary
being in power. They are going to be a global power. So their focus is very clear. And therefore, one needs to study and understand, because they are competing not with India, they're competing with USA, the greatest power. You rightly said that they have got today more naval vessels than USA in numbers. Of course, in tonnage, the Americans are still ahead. You have rightly said in space. Space is where the next frontier is. The number of annual launches for the last 3 years is more than USA's. In fact, it's more than USA, India, and many European countries put together.
Wow.
That's the kind of advances they are making. These figures must bother us. There is a gap. We have a modernization backlog within the country. You know that Indian Air Force is down to 30 squadrons instead of 42. They're already having 150 fifth-generation aircraft. They have got hypersonic glide vehicles, which have been tested and actually operationalized. So in many fields, in AI, in quantum, in cyber, in electronic warfare, the Chinese have pumped in huge amount of monies. And you rightly said, Japan has last year announced their national security strategy, in which they have said that they will go to 2% of the GDP as their defense budget by in next 5 years, that is by 2027. Everybody is spending. Of course, the AUKUS has been done to make the Australians spend more money because a continental-sized country was spending less than South Korea.
Yeah.
So that is the aim of the exercise. So action is going to be on Indo-Pacific, and for us, Chinese are already making friends in Indian Ocean. Their physical presence has increased. They are sitting in Djibouti. Gwadar is fully operational. It's a great port. They are in Hanbantota. They are sitting all over.
And fears about them being in Myanmar also.
And of course, they are close to Myanmar. They've invested in Bangladesh, of course, that so-called string of pearls. I must tell you that Indian government in the last 5 years has to some extent neutralized by making friends in the neighborhood, and we are doing a great job. Our Look East, Act East is working well. Many countries, right up to Vietnam, Philippines, are good friends of ours now. We are working with Indonesia. We are working in Singapore. We are doing exercises, military exercises with all of them. So the government is working on that, but the fact is that the gap between India and China continues to build, and we must do something to bridge that gap. Let me also say on the positive side, you know, on the border roads, the infrastructure, India is doing a great job, though China is much ahead of us. The total strength of the Indian Army sitting in the Himalayas is significant. We will, in many sectors, we are much better off than them. The number of airfields the Indian Air Force has got, 25 of them, and planes at lower altitudes vis-a-vis the 11, 12, the Chinese have got at much higher altitude. We are sitting reasonably all right, but certainly the amount of training, the materials that they are bringing in here, the cyber and the quantum of missiles that they have got, whether they're cruise missiles or they're ground-based missiles, is much larger, and therefore we must increase. And I will mention to you as we go along, where are the areas that we need to increase? Yes.
Absolutely. So we need to increase. There's no question that Air Marshal Chopra is talking about the strategic gap between India and China has been growing. And, we would ideally hope for at least 3% of India's GDP should be spent on defense to try and catch up. And of course, Air Marshal, in a broader sense, the competition is also about economic growth between India and China, and hopefully we are poised for substantially faster growth than them in the next 10 years. So then, as we go forward, the gap will hopefully start reducing. So that we are comfortably placed. But like you said, there are terrain advantages we may have in some parts where we are contesting with the Chinese, and the partnerships, the strategic partnership, because India is a democracy, we are more trusted by a lot of Western countries. We have defense diplomacy, a lot of them are willing to share technology and co-produce with us. The Western countries are quite wary of transferring anything of dual use or military to China. So in that sense, hopefully, I think the conditions are good for us to close the gap, isn't it, going forward?
Yeah, undoubtedly, first we have to have a great economy for us to be able to spend more on defense. 3.7 trillion this year, 5 trillion 2025 target, highly achievable. So I think we are all right. Defense production, we have sold 13,000 crores of exports of defense production this year.
First time, yeah. We are aiming for $2 to $3 billion of exports. Yeah.
We are on a good track in many areas. Initiatives, the last budget, Make in India initiative, Atmanirbharta, it's, I think, happening in a great way. Partnerships is what you mentioned. And I must say, Quad started slowly, in between slowed down, but now in the last 3-4 years, Quad has come up. We have got in Quad, with all the 3 countries, we are the 4th, we have got 2+2 dialogue with all. We have interoperability arrangements with all. We are exercising, all the 3 services are exercising with all the countries. And look at the partners that the West has got. Japan, South Korea, Philippines,
they are
Australia,
allies, pretty allies.
India, Vietnam, all are relatively better economies. Who's got Chinese friends? Myanmar,
North Korea,
Cambodia, North Korea, Pakistan. 4. All 4 of them dithering as far as the economy is concerned.
So if you actually do a matchup of the coalitions, so to say, then we are better placed.
I have done an analysis on the physical strength, number of ships, aircraft carriers, tanks. Of course, tanks not as relevant as much as the ships and aircraft. I have done the analysis, and you find that this coalition is much, much stronger. And if we as India has to make sure that in Indian Ocean we continue to dominate, and we have the potential, we need to develop the Andaman and Nicobars and some other actions we have to do. And I agree with you, we have to go up in defense budget. Maybe 3% you're mentioning is ambitious. Let's at least reach 2.5 from 2.03 that we are currently.
Absolutely. So viewers, the thing is we are trying to catch up and reduce the strategic gap with China. And now I'd like us to hear from one of our best national security experts. He teaches at Jindal Global University, Professor Pankaj Jha, and talking about what are the specific weapons, and platforms and systems that Indian military, all the three wings need going forward, especially to face the Chinese competition. Let's hear him and continue the discussion.
One of the important issues which comes up, that what will be the future warfare be like, because India is facing two basic adversaries, Pakistan and China. With China in mind, I believe there is a need for more work, more research, more innovation in the field of hyperspectral sensors, in the field of electronic warfare. But if you look into how the different wings of the armed forces should prepare accordingly, I believe in the Air Force domain, there is a need for much more work with regard to precision guided long range strikes and missiles. Also, we need to look into how these electronic warfare is going to shape up in the future, and disruptive technologies which can really interfere with your onboard systems, particularly avionics, is a critical area which we need to look into it. In Army, I believe there is a lot of research which has been done in terms of robotics and robotic modes you have recently got. But it needs to be seen that how you can protect the soldier, how you can enhance the mobility of the soldiers, both physically and mentally, and also look for a smart soldier which can be protected through various armor and other kind of equipment which can help him to get a sense of the theater. In terms of Navy, I believe there is a lot which is going to happen in the next 10 odd years, particularly in terms of quantum computing, quantum sensors. Undersea warfare is going to get more intense, given the fact that countries like China are really looking and toying with the undersea gliders and have also identified Indian Ocean as one of the areas where they will be focusing on. In this regard, the Navy requires a lot of work with regard to smart mines and smart frigates, as well as looking into these aspects.
So viewers, that's a big bucket list of things that India needs. Professor Pankaj Jha talking about it. Air Marshal, clearly there are specific weapon systems more future oriented. From what I could get as a civilian and a non-specialist in defense, he's mostly talking about electronics and computerized and information based needs going forward. So a lot of emphasis on digital and future technologies, and that's something where I think we have been lagging, because in R&D, for example, as percentage of GDP, it's less than 1% in India, and Prime Minister has this mission innovation and startups. Even in defense, we have the IDEX. We're trying to stimulate an environment where more innovation happens in these fields for indigenous manufacturing. But the point is the Chinese are spending 2.4 to 2.5% of GDP on R&D. So there is a gap, and hopefully more private players should come in. Your thoughts on what Professor Jha was just talking about, what we need and how much further we can drum up our resources, our human capital and our talent to make this happen, the dream of an indigenous weapons power like China has become.
Like the Army chief mentioned, China has moved from being an informatized warfare to intelligentized warfare. Both these warfares require technology, electronics, competition, quantum. All these require these things. Now, we are still at the information warfare stage. We have to take another leap forward. Let me tell you what the services require first as a common technologies: AI, robotics, quantum. We require cyber. We require electronic. Mind you, cyber and electronic warfare, not new technology. They have been there for the last 30 years. And only thing is we require the latest among them. So hypersonics, directed energy weapons. These are the 5-6 areas which India is trying to concentrate, but we are still far behind. We are still at the experimental stage in hypersonic, hypersonic
disruptive technology.
Technology. So there are common technologies that all the services require, because we saw after Galwan the amount of action that took place on cyber for the next 15 days were 1,000 times the normal cyber action. So that is the kind of things, not going by service to service. First, munitions. We have seen in Ukraine the amount of munitions that have been used. The Russians had to fork up their production by 3 times. So there is a need for cruise missiles. There is a need ground-based or airborne, where the BrahMos has to be pushed. Look at the Air Force. Down to 30 squadrons. We need more squadrons. We require FRAs. We require AEWCs. In other areas, we are all right. Navy requires perhaps an aircraft carrier. It's a big decision.
And more submarines.
Submarines. Not only submarines, we need nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines.
SSBN.
So there are SSBN and SSN. We require both of them. So there is, the armed forces have a backlog on which we need to work. We need to push in some more money. And R&D, the last point I want to mention, is we need to spend much more money in R&D. You know that nobody is giving you engine technology, nobody is giving you hypersonic, nobody is giving you modern technologies. We have to
develop them ourselves.
Develop them on our own.
So viewers, discussion with Air Marshal Chopra brings out a fundamental truth, is that we are in a much more dangerous and insecure era of world politics. India is in a much more volatile neighborhood, especially because of the China challenge. We haven't even talked about Pakistan, but they have a more of a non-conventional pose of a non-conventional threat. But the fundamental conventional adversary is China, and we need to brace for a long struggle and competition with them in the military sphere. And it's unavoidable. We share the same strategic sphere, and there's very less trust between the two countries, and they are actually amping up massively in terms of their military spending, and we cannot afford to be behind them. And I want to thank Air Marshal Chopra for sharing so many valuable technical and strategic insights with the audience. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Sreeram. Always a pleasure. Yes.
So viewers, let's focus on India's military needs, how it is linked to our diplomacy, how it can enhance our strategic options or even constrict our strategic options. Going forward, it's unavoidable. We need to invest more in the military, and we need to catch up with those who are ahead of us, or else it can create a very bleak strategic stability and security for the country. So let's focus on military spending. It's a very important ingredient that determines India's rise in the world. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.